Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I think we should lower that first. Can we lower it? بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم اللهم انشر علينا رحمتك وأنزل علينا حكمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. I have a short quote there that you may have seen, that cleanliness is half of faith. الطهارة شطر الإيمان. It's a very, very short hadith that cleanliness is half of faith. And in this case, it's absolutely essential, because to be in a state of ritual purity, to be in a state of tahara, is a prerequisite for many, many other matters within the religion. Of course, prayer, but fasting, reciting or reading or touching the Quran, and then matters of divorce. So many things are interlinked. And so that's why we said it's very important for us to have a special session. I would recommend everybody, with the last session and with this session, listen to it a second time, because we have it recorded in YouTube. And so what you can do is, when you hear it the second time, even if you're driving somewhere, listen to it, and you'll retain a lot more of the information, the details, because sometimes we go very fast. Bismillah. So the agenda today is we want to talk about the law pertaining to hayd, the menstrual periods, postnatal bleeding, that's after delivering a baby, chronic discharge, the istihada, right? So this happens in a case in which it exceeds the maximum number of days, or it could be irregular bleeding. Then what are the limitations? So if a woman is not in a state of tahara, of tuhur, as we say, of purity, then there are certain restrictions that are placed. And so we also need to know, by extension, what is permissible. Now, there are other aspects of Sharia that are also implicated, so we'll discuss about that. And I know Hajj is just around the corner. We're actually, I think, exactly 1 month away. Well, by then you're already in the middle of Hajj, 1 month. So probably 3 weeks away from people departing for their Hajj, because Hajj is 1 month, so you need to get there. So we want to make sure that we give you the information that you need in order to perform it successfully, inshaAllah. May Allah accept all of our worship and give them Hajj Mabrur, an accepted and a righteous Hajj. So before we even go, we need to kind of give a little bit of the backdrop, the medical aspect. This is not a religious diagram, but this I just wanted us to be aware that there's a variety of different colors. And so the normal discharge is the clear discharge, right? Because that's what you want to see in the end of the period. And that indicates that now you're ready to take the ghusl and to wash. But there are lots of other colors. For example, I mean, red, of course, everybody knows, that's the standard. But you might have other colors that will also count towards the hayd. We're going to talk about the opinion of Aisha radiallahu anha. But I just want to alert people also that you can learn about your health also from the color, because if you're getting an abnormal discharge, it could be a medical case where there could be an infection, there could be something bacterial, there could be some mucus. So there's information in there, right? And of course, the darkness, in the beginning it's one color, and then when it's the regular flow, it's going to be a different shade of red, but that's within the same red and brown category. So that's what the normal blood in the hayd, that's what you're looking for. So there are 3 different topics here. One is the menstrual period, that's the hayd. Then there's nifas, which is the postnatal bleeding, and then istihada. And this is, we're going to spend a lot of time on the last one, because the general rule is kind of easy. Many of you probably already know it. So what we're going to discuss is the issue of irregular periods. Now this can be, it used to be a big subject in the books of fiqh, but it's an even bigger topic now, because it's prevalent for people to take hormones or birth control or to have, what's it called, IUD, yes, IUD device, and depending on whether it's physical or it's hormonal, it will affect the cycle. And so sometimes it can upset the number of days, and so it's important to be aware of what the rules are when there's an irregular cycle. And that's part of the reason why we have this session. So the general definition is that the hayd is blood that discharges forcefully from the uterus, right? So this is not something, this is not a cut, this is not coming from another part, but we're generally going to assume that, there are kind of signs that, are you going to really determine is it from the uterus? But you can understand that from a female who has attained puberty, who is not ill or pregnant and has not reached the age of menopause. So the maximum age is going to be 55, right? In which then you get into istihada. But of course, menopause, it can happen earlier. I've heard people say that it's, I think people have it earlier and earlier, and puberty is also happening earlier and earlier. I'm not a doctor, so I don't know why that's happening socially, but that's what I've heard. But pregnancy is another thing. There might be some small spotting or bleeding during pregnancy, and of course, medically you want to make sure everything is okay with the baby, because if it's a lot of bleeding, there's a medical issue. But if there's spotting, that's not going to be considered as part of the period, as the hayd, right? Because it's not consistent that you're going to have a period and be pregnant in the same time. So now we're getting into the number of days, which is the main topic. So for the Hanafi school, the minimum number of days is 3 days and 3 nights, right? So that means 24 times 3, so I think that's 72 hours. And then for the Shafi'is, it's 1 day and 1 night, so 24 hours. Now that matters because sometimes with irregular bleeding, you're going to have 1 day, you're going to have less than 1 day, and then there's a gap, and then it happens again. And so now you have to, there's no, all of the schools agree that this is, you need to have a minimum of 15 days in between. And we'll get to that. So because of that, you're going to have to do a little bit of arithmetic, and you're going to have to add it together. Now, the average is about 5 days, but everybody's different, right? And the maximum is 10. So the simple rule of thumb is 3 to 10, right? This is according to the Ahnaf, the Hanafi school. According to the Shafi'is, then the maximum is 15 days. However, I would recommend to you to use the 3 to 10 days. I think this matches the experience of most people. And the 15 days for the period of tuhur. That's, of course, if that's the madhab that you're following, but people should stick with what they're doing. For the Malikis, there is no minimum. That means that even if you have just a little bit of spotting, that's going to be considered as a hayd, right? And so that is clocked in. And then sometimes it can be confusing if you have more than one happening within that 15-day period. So we'll get to that example soon. So here's a little bit of details on that, right? So we're talking about somebody that's reached the age of maturity with puberty. The minimum of that is 9 years old, right? So if it happens before that, before 9, it's considered istihada. It's not considered from the hayd. And just as a general matter, once a girl experiences menstruation after 9, so then she's reached the age of maturity, or she has a dream in which there's a discharge, or if there's pregnancy, hopefully that's not something we need to worry about, but that would also meet the definition for reaching maturity. Now, it's recommended in the books of fiqh to use pads rather than to put anything inside. I think that's the general practice nowadays, and in the market, people know what works best. You're not going to get that information from me, right? So anything below the minimum, right? So below the 3 days, or over the maximum, which is the 10 days, that is istihada. This is the most important thing in figuring out about tahara, which is that if it's below 3 or if it's over 10, it does not count as part of the period. Now for the Shafi'is, it will be the 1 day. So we mentioned red, yellow, and dark fluid. Dark meaning like brown fluid. That's all considered within the hayd, but be aware medically of any issues that need attention. Until in the books of fiqh they say white, but actually it's really clear. That's normally but people know what their normal discharge is. So according to the opinion of Aisha, and this is the opinion that most of the books of fiqh, most of the schools follow, is that anything but the white discharge is considered as a menstrual blood. So you don't need to get into the different colors, right? If it's not the normal, I would say clear, they say white, so it's going to be considered as part of the period. Now nifas is after delivering the baby, there's postnatal bleeding. It can vary a lot from one person to another. It discharges after giving birth. The maximum number of days, according to most of the schools, is 40 days. There's no minimum. There's even people, it will be a very short period, couple of days, and then that's it. But Anas reported that the Prophet ﷺ prescribed that it should be 40 days, except if she's purified before that. So what that means, and the Shafi'is, it's 60 days. So that means that anything that is in excess of the 40 days of postnatal bleeding, or 60 days in the Shafi'i case, is going to be considered istihada. So same thing with the period, anything below 3 and over 10 is istihada. Istihada is very important because it takes a special rule in which the prayers are to be performed, fasting is to be observed, and you take your wudu in each case. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So here's the istihada. Chronic discharge, which used to be, of course it happened in the past, but I have found that it is becoming more and more prevalent because of the medications that people are using. It has a lot of side effects. Irregular periods have become very, very common, and it becomes very hard to manage and to figure out what's really going on. What that means is discharge that stops in less than 3 days. Now this is the problem, because if you have 2 days of bleeding, so you're waiting. When you first get it, you're like, okay, this is the period. So you stop praying, you observe the rules that follow for the period. Then it ends, right? Then you're in the 3rd day and everything is clear, and so you assume that it's fine. But then 10 days later, then you start spotting again, or you start bleeding again, or 5 days later, or whatever number of days, or there's a 2-period gap. Then what do you do? Because there have to be 15 intervening days, right? So this is where istihada comes into play. But the problem that I always struggle with is that you don't know the future. So after the 2 days, you're like, okay, it's done. But in reality, it's not done, because there's more. But how would you know that? Nobody knows what's going to happen next, right? If it's in excess of the 10, and we'll give the examples and we'll give the answer to that in a minute. So if you go over the 10 days, then that's also istihada, chronic discharge. Excess of the 40 days, as we mentioned. Imam al-Shafi'i, his teaching is that you should wash the private area and apply absorbent pad before wudu. The others, they said, because it's not considered the period bleeding, so they did not really impose that as a requirement. But as a matter of best practice, I think most people, they would wash up and they would take those precautions anyway, right? But this is something that within the Shafi'i school is prescribed. The other thing that you have to consider is your normal habit, right? So what is the ada? So a woman that has regular days, that bleeds beyond her regular days, and it persists until the maximum, is deemed istihada. So sometimes the Hanafi rules can become very complicated, because let's say your norm is your period is 6 days, right? And the maximum is 10, which is 4. But let's say you go beyond those 6 days, right? And then you get to the maximum, then retroactively 7, 8, 9, 10, and onwards are all considered istihada. But you didn't know that until you reached the 10 days, right? And so this is the rule, which is that you should go back to your habit. I would suggest, this is the classical opinion, okay? But a lot of the contemporary jurists, they would say just keep it simple with the 3 and 10 days and just observe based on that with the 15 days. So this is what I'm suggesting, but this is not the classical opinion, this is the contemporary opinion, which is simplified for people because calculating the habit and adding the days together and figuring out going backwards after days have already passed can be very complicated. Because if you're bleeding, right, you probably are not praying, although you could do a ghusl and take a precautionary prayer just in case. That can also be very stressful and very confusing for a person. So that's why I think maybe taking the contemporary approach is better. And we can discuss this in the questions, right? So the regular days, your habit is defined as the last thing that you saw, which can change. For the Malikis, it's simplified, which is that you go to your, not your last one, but your prior longest hayd. So the Hanafis, they would say, okay, what's your norm? And your norm is the last one. So the last one was 6 days, so you carry that on to the next one, that your regular days are 6. But for the Malikis, they would say, no, what's the longest that you've ever had? Okay, that's 7. So then 7 plus 3, that's 10. So once you go beyond 10, then it's going to be istihada. The reason also they have this rule is because they don't have a maximum of 10, right? So these are two different approaches. But I told you what my suggestion is the 3, 10, and 15. And it's simplified and easy to understand. So the pure days, as we mentioned, and this is confirmed by all of the Muslims, all the schools of fiqh, they're following the 15 days because it's by authentic hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that a woman cannot have 2 periods within a 15-day period. There must be a minimum of 15 days of tuhur. It's the same in the Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali schools. So if you have that chronic bleeding, so what you do is you'll leave the prayer, you'll leave fasting from the first sight of blood for the 10 days. Then, given the maximum of 15 days, you'll deem pure. And if you start seeing some bleeding afterwards, what are you going to consider that? You're going to consider istihada, exactly, right? Because you completed your hayd as within the specifications 3 and 10, now you're done, you entered into a period of tuhur, and then it's within that 15 days, so you have to have at least 15 days. So even if you have bleeding for 3 or 4 days, you're going to consider that as istihada and you'll continue to pray because you already had your period. So the second one is not the real one. This is the contemporary approach that I'm recommending. The classical opinion in the Hanafi school is to go back to your regular schedule. What is your habit, right? And then you go to your habit and then you have to add those habit days and find out how many days were missing. So let's say it was 4 days and then there were missing days and then you have to add that to the period. So it gets very complicated in order to figure out how many days are missing and then to figure out whether to count them as valid bleeding or invalid bleeding, right? And if there are more questions about that, we can analyze it, if somebody wants to follow the more classical opinion. And if you have a period of purification during the period, you're going to treat this as a continuous flow. This is according to all of the 4 schools. That if you have 3 days and then there's 2 days of tuhur, and then you have another 3 days, so 3, 2, 3. How many days long was the period? 3, 2, and 3. So 6 and then, so it will be 8, exactly. So even though there was an intervening period of tuhur of 2 days, because it was bookended on both sides with bleeding, so the total 8, even those 2 days, there's no such thing as having a period of purification that's less than the 15 days between those two. So what ends up happening is either it's a continual period, or if you reach the max, then it's istihada. If you haven't reached the max, then it's a continuous flow in that case. Okay, so some examples just to confuse you, hopefully to give you some clarity, inshallah. Number one is Khadija sees blood for 2 days, then no blood. Then she sees a spot of blood on day 7. Okay, so that means day 7, so there were 4 days in between in which there was tuhur. So she thought that it was istihada. So you have to get into the mind of Khadija, right? She had bleeding for 2 days. What is she thinking? Is she thinking this is my period? The first 2 days she thought it exactly. But then on the 3rd day, when everything cleared out, then she realized, no, this is istihada, right? So she prayed on the 3rd day, right? Everybody with me? Because now she knew that this is istihada, right? So she started to pray and do everything. But then when there was blood on day 7, what did she realize? It's not an again period, it's the same period. Even though there was 4 days in between in which there was tuhur, because of the 2 days, then the 4 days, right? And then on the 7th day there's bleeding. So at that moment she thought it's istihada, but now she realizes that actually it's all menstruation, one single period, because it's within the maximum, and the maximum is 10 days, right? So this is a situation that might happen either to you or to somebody that you know. So if you know the rule, you can apply it very easily. She prayed those days because she didn't know.
Is it genuine? She could pray?
No, not only that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is generous, so لا يضيع أجر المحسنين. So He's going to reward her for those days, and the days of her period she's excused. So she's ahead of us, right? So because she didn't need to pray and then she prayed not knowing that, so I think she's in a better state.
Same thing to fasting, if those 3 days she will fast where there was no bleeding.
Yeah, this is a good question. Thank you. This is a very good question, which I didn't put in the example. If she fasted that day, which is good, and inshallah she'll be rewarded for that, does that day count? Does it count? Remember which day it is. This is the 3rd day. She was bleeding for 2. It will not be counted. And this is pretty much according to all the schools. This is why this example is very important and very relevant. That she will need to make up that day because she did not know at the time, but she was in the middle of her period. There was just a gap in which there was tuhur. But in fact, she was in her period, and so therefore she needs to make up that day. We shouldn't worry. Women who have their period, they should not be worried about reward from Allah. Don't even consider that, because and we'll mention just a moment, according to some of the fuqaha, because they said, how would Allah reward those women? Will it be based on your average prayer? Will it be based on your minimum prayer? Because it's a hypothetical prayer that you didn't do, right? So how much would Allah reward you? So one of the opinions, and I find it very convincing to be true, which is that a woman would be rewarded according to the best of her prayers, right? So if sometimes you're at a 3, one day you're at a 5, then one day you do, you're really attentive, and this is an 8 out of 10. So Allah is going to reward you according to that prayer. So because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this dispensation, it's not possible for Allah to create a rukhsah. It's impossible that He will create a dispensation, an excuse, and then penalize you for using that. I mean, in fact, it's not using it, you have to use it, right? Because you're not able to pray. So otherwise that would put women at a disadvantage, and this is why all of the scholars in Islamic history from beginning until now, they have all said the same thing, that women are not at any disadvantage when it comes to reward. As to whether it takes them out of the habit, that's another matter. And that is something we should be attentive to, which is that, if you are you get to the last 10 nights of Ramadan and you get your period, it can be very upsetting for people, right? Because they wanted to use those nights in order to do their devotion and to pray. And then you have to be very creative in worshiping in the month of Ramadan when you're in the middle of your period, and then you might be uncomfortable and you might be in some pain. So that aspect is very much real. But the reward aspect, we should not worry about that. Okay, example number 2. Sauda sees blood for 4 days followed by no blood. Then a spot on day 7. So 4, and then there's another 2 days, and then on day 7, then she sees a spot. So the intervening period is blood, so it's a 7-day total. This is similar to the first example. We know that now. Now, the abnormal example, this is the one which is really hard, right? In which there's a difference of opinion. Aisha usually gets 7:22, that's not a date. What that means is she gets, how long is her period normally? 7 days. And how long is her period of purity? 22 days. So according to Islam, every woman that's getting her period should be tracking it. Nowadays you have an app, so you just punch it in the app, and medically it's also good for you to pay attention to that, but you should always be tracking that and know the number of days of the period and also when it started and when it ended. So my recommendation to everybody is punch it all into the app, and then you don't have to, it takes the brain work out of it. And then 22 days of purity. She sees blood for 3 days. Right? Then 14 days of tuhr, right? So remember the rule. How long does the purity have to be? Has to be 15, so it's just short of it. 14 days. And normally she gets 22 days. Then she gets blood for 2 days. This is a really wonky, crazy example. Right? This is not likely. But the reason I made this example is just in case, because it could happen. I have seen this happen. It could happen when somebody starts on birth control. So these type of situations happen. Otherwise, it's not normally going to happen. The contemporary view that I'm suggesting is make wudu for every salah because it is irregular. Because the bleeding that she's getting, it has nothing to do with her normal, regular habit. And it's outside of the 10-day window. Remember in the 2 examples, it was within the 10-day window. So now we're outside of that. So even though it did not meet the 15 days requirement, right, we will consider it as istihada. But the classical opinion was not that. The classical opinion is because we did not get the 15 days of tuhr, so what we need to do is we need to take the habitual days and then we need to add it to continue those days after it and until we reach the 10. And then after that it will be considered invalid bleeding. But to me it seems very technical and it doesn't seem very accurate in doing so. So what are the limitations? The limitations are prayer, and tawaf is a form of prayer. By the way, a lot of people, as I mentioned before, they're FaceTiming their mom and family members while they're in tawaf and they're doing business transactions. This is actually a huge mistake, right? Now, it could be that they completed the tawaf and then they're calling somebody. Say, I just finished tawaf, and that's okay, but you should have respect for the place that you are at. But otherwise, it's generally permissible. But if you're in tawaf, you're in the state of prayer. So you can only limit it to necessary speech, right? Because the regular salah, you're not allowed to talk. But in the tawaf, it's permissible to speak, but you are still in prayer. So it should be necessary speech. Until you take your ghusl, prostration, if you're doing sajdat al-sahu, sajdat al-shukr, if you're doing the prostration of gratitude, you need to have tahara as well. Fasting until the end. This always happens to everybody, right? They get their period right before Salat al-Maghrib, right? And that can be really aggravating, but that's just the way it is. Then you get reward. You have to always think positive, that I got the reward for whatever I did, and I'm going to make up the day and I'm going to get the full reward again. So I'm actually ahead, I'm not behind. right? Recitation of a verse of the Quran, whether it is from memory or it is from the Mus'haf, right? So even reciting the verses from your own memory, according to the majority of the schools, is not permissible, but the Malikis permit it. And many of the contemporary scholars, they would recommend, I think I also recommend to follow the Maliki view, that permits reciting the Quran and touching the non-Mus'haf. In today, what would we consider the non-Mus'haf? That would be our phones. Exactly. So traditionally, reciting the Quran from your phone while in a state of the period is not permissible by the majority of the schools of thought. But Imam Malik's opinion is that it is the Quran that cannot be touched with that absolute rule. And so if you're taking a book of tafsir or you're taking an app, then it would be permissible to do so. And the reason for that is because there's a need to learn the Quran and for fear of losing it. We've recommended this also to people during the month of Ramadan, but you should be consistent. You can't make a rule just for the month of Ramadan, right? But so that way they don't miss out on that time period. Some people would say, wait a minute, it's a different rule, and it is. Because a person who is in a state of janaba, right? So they had intercourse, and how come that person is not able to read the Quran? Explain that to me. Why is it that we're giving preference to the lady that's in her period compared to the one that had intercourse? The one who, because remember the excuse is because she needs to learn and to study the Quran. Why can't we give the same excuse to the person in janaba? The person in the state of janaba, are they stuck in that state? Do they have control over it? The woman who has her period, can she stop her period? Can she use her willpower and stop that period? Is it possible? Then all women would do it. Let's just get rid of this, right? But somebody that's in a state of janaba, can they remove the condition of janaba? They can. All they have to do is take a bath. So that excuse is not available for them. So the person in janaba is not able to take advantage of this. They cannot read or recite or touch the Quran. Okay, that's an absolute among all of the schools of thought, except for the Salafis. Nowadays, people, they say it's the opinion of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, but we don't know it to be the opinion of Imam Ahmad. But this is also found among a lot of the Salafi scholars that they said that, but this is an unknown opinion. But when it comes to women in their period, this is a well-established opinion from Imam Malik. So I would consider if somebody wants to take advantage of that, maybe they can discuss it with Dr. Tariq. I'm not a mufti, right, to give you a ruling. I'm just giving the class to educate everyone and myself. But if you want to take that, you can discuss it with him or a scholar that can guide you in that. Touching the Quran except with a separate covering. So this is the Hanafi opinion, which is that if you have a separate covering, not the binder, not the cover of the book, but if you take a piece of cloth or a covering, you can touch the Quran in that case. Entering the masjid is also not permissible. I'll talk about that in a moment. For example, when you go for Hajj or Umrah, this comes every year that I have taken a group for Umrah. There are always 3 to 5 women that are having their period when we enter into Mecca, consistently, every year, because nobody asks us. We do workshops, we send emails, and because, it's not in our culture to talk about these things. So, yeah, actually that makes it worse. People, they start birth control right before coming for Umrah in order to shift the days. But then it actually makes it worse because you need to stabilize it at least a few months before, right? And actually, it's not only me. All of the imams we have more experience in this than even a lot of the ladies, because we deal with these questions, right? It comes up all the time. So we would be able to advise them, but they don't bring it up until we're in Mecca and we're in Ihram and we're about to do Umrah, and they're like, oh, by the way, I can't go. And so, we try to accommodate that as best as we can. So one of the recommendations that I give is that it is permissible, according to the majority opinion, to enter the masjid mururan. Meaning you can pass through the masjid. Let's say you left your keys in the masjid. It's not like there's a force field. You can't enter the masjid because you're in your period. If there's some necessary, or maybe if there's a meeting, even within this masjid, we really just consider this is a community center. So really the masjid is just this area. And then if we have a meeting in another place, or Sunday school is another thing that might be on people's mind for teachers. But they're there to teach the class, so it can fall within that category, that you're passing through, you're not staying or worshiping within the masjid. So in that case, it would be permissible. So when we do that, people, they say, well, I want to see the Kaaba. So I tell them, I said, go ahead. And then do you know what they tell me every time? But I Googled it and it said I can't. And then we have to deal with the Google thing, right? Because when you Google things, you're going to get 100 different answers. And some of them will say, oh, no, it's fine. You can go and you can stay in the masjid. My suggestion, I think the correct opinion, and I think Dr. Tariq will say the same, according to the Shafi'i opinion, which is that you can enter into the masjid, but you should not remain there, right? So you can see the Kaaba, and then once you're ready to perform the Umrah, then you can do it at that point. Sexual intercourse is also prohibited, and there's a difference of opinion between, they call it sexual istimta', right? So you guys, you know what that means, right? So other than intercourse itself, between the navel and the bottom of the knees, this is a hadith from Zayd ibn Aslam. Many of the contemporary scholars, including the contemporary Hanafi scholars, they said that if it's not with the private part of the male, then it would be permissible, and that hadith is about that. I think it makes sense in the times that we live in, and if there's no specific prohibition in the hadith, then we should go with the more relaxed rule. So I would suggest you can follow the contemporary rule, because otherwise it becomes, then it's like you can't even touch each other, and it can become very restrictive otherwise. And the hadith doesn't say that explicitly, so there's no reason to take that. Aisha's view, and this is the opinion that was followed by Muhammad. When I say Muhammad, I mean Muhammad al-Shaybani, right? Because Imam Hanifa, he has three main students: Abu Yusuf, you have Zufar, and you have Muhammad al-Shaybani. And Muhammad al-Shaybani is also the teacher of Imam al-Shafi'i. So all of these four Imams, they studied from each other. This should be very clear. There's nothing antagonistic between the schools of fiqh. They're all trying to arrive at the truth. So again, in these topics, we always end up with the opinion of Aisha radiallahu anha most of the time, because her viewpoints on this, I think, and most of the scholars of fiqh, they think, is the most sound. Because she's thought about it, she lived it. And the Prophet ﷺ was with her. So why would we refuse her opinion? We're going to go with hers first before we take a man's opinion, basically, right? So Aisha's opinion was that avoid the place of the blood itself, right? And then other than that, the rest is permissible, which is what I'm suggesting. Okay. Some rulings to apply. If the bleeding reaches the maximum number of days, then it is permissible to have intercourse even without ghusl. Now, obviously, I think none of us are doing that, right? Because normally, we like to bathe and be fresh, but why is that permissible? Hatta yatuhurn. So it says in the ayah, until they have become pure. It doesn't say until they have purified themselves. That means that by operation of law, once you reach the 10th day, so now you're pure. So you don't need to do the ghusl. But if it's below the 10 days, you haven't reached the maximum, you've completed your regular period, then you must take a ghusl. If you're unable to perform the ghusl, then you perform tayammum. Now that tayammum, this came up with Sister Zamuda's question last week. That tayammum is for that ritual prayer. That tayammum is just for that. So that tayammum is not giving you complete purity. it's giving you like a temporary pass. It's like a hall pass. That, okay, now I'm going to pray with that tayammum. But it's not the same like the ghusl. The ghusl has to be done, but until you're able to do the ghusl, you can do the tayammum in its place if you're unable to perform or if there's a lack of availability of water. And then you wait until the time of one's next prayer. Again, everything ad-din yusr. Islam is easy. It should be easy. We don't need to make it complicated. So if that happens, so let's say at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, let's say 1 o'clock at the time of dhuhr, then your period ends. Do you have to pray dhuhr? Dhuhr started at 12:59 and you became pure at 1 o'clock. Do you have to hurry up and do ghusl in order to pray the dhuhr prayer? No.
We can delay the dhuhr.
Because you're in the dhuhr prayer. There's two opinions. One of them is that you can wait until the time of the next prayer, and then even then you have the purity, even without doing the ghusl. And some would say you have to do the Asr prayer. Others would say that you start from the Maghrib prayer, right? Because if you gain purity between Dhuhr and Asr, so then you start in Maghrib, and then if it happens in the nighttime, then you start from the Fajr prayer, right? But I think it's better just go to the next prayer. That's an easy rule, and that's a safer rule. If the bleeding stops short, right, less than that, intercourse is not permissible until you've completed your regular days. This is important. A lot of people don't know this, that if your period is normally 6 days and it ends after 2 days, you're not supposed to have intercourse, right? Because you're still kind of waiting to see if the blood is going to return, right? And similarly, you're going to pray, you're going to fast, but it's what we call a precautionary fast, right? Because you don't know if there's going to be a return or not, so you're going to pray and you're going to fast, but it might be the case that those are actually period days. And I mentioned there's a narration that the prayer is missed written. There's an athar, right? So probably from the time of the Sahaba, not from the Prophet ﷺ, that the prayers missed are written as the best prayer that you used to offer, right? So because it can be average, it can be the worst, it's got to be that or better. So Allah is generous, we have more reason to believe that it will be the best prayer. Now the iddah period, the waiting period, is also based on the periods, and the periods do not interrupt kafara days. So let's say you have a kafara, you need to fast 60 days. For males, it's very difficult because you have to do 60 days continuous. It's brutal. It's very, very hard. And if you interrupt it on the 45th day, you got to start all over again. But as a woman, if you receive your period, then you continue the count right after your period without any interruption. And it's not considered that there was any interruption, you just continue the count. Now the unlawful acts in the state of janaba, you cannot pray, recite a verse from the Quran, touch the Quran without covering, enter the mosque or make tawaf. We talked about that. Hadith is like going to the bathroom, we've talked about. Prayer, tawaf, and touching the Quran without covering. We know this from the last session and this one. Istihada, this is the key one. If you have invalid bleeding, then it takes the ruling of a nosebleed. It takes the ruling of a nosebleed because that nosebleed is breaking your wudu according to the Hanafi opinion, but it does not prevent you from praying. Why? You're able to fast, you're able to pray, you can also have intercourse because you are in the state of the ma'adur. You're in the state of the one who is excused. So you make your wudu, you do whichever prayers you need to do, and then you continue until the next prayer, and then you make another wudu. So every time you have a prayer, you make a fresh wudu, and you continue. And some people say, oh, but I don't know, what if there's bleed? Don't overthink it. You're going to drive yourself crazy. right? You know, as far as you know, this bleeding is not from the bleeding of the hayd. You're gonna make wudu. You don't have to do a ghusl, right? Even though you're like, well, what if, you know, you're gonna, you know, purify yourself as best as you can, and you make your wudu and you pray and you continue and you assume the best that it's accepted. Now we're getting to the end. There are some shari'i implications. There are rulings on divorce, lineage, permissibility of intercourse, prayer, fasting, Quran. Look at how many things are affected by the rules that we talked about. Now, of course, those ladies that have reached menopause, they're like, well, this is irrelevant to me. But actually, no, because you may have your daughters, you may have granddaughters, you may have other family members. And so within every family, there's always like one person who's knowledgeable, right? And nowadays we have like WhatsApp groups. So everybody, you know, so we can contact each other, we can benefit from each other, and you can get that instant feedback. People don't want to ask the Imam all the time. You're all welcome to ask me, but if you have this knowledge and information, you'll hopefully be able to figure it out on your own as well. When it comes to divorce, people don't realize that the way that people divorce nowadays, I mean, I've met people sometimes, they're like, I'm ready to get divorced, they file divorce, and I'm like, okay, you pronounce divorce once. And they say, no, I thought you have to do it 3 times. People argue with me, they're like, no, it's not divorce. I said, no, this is not a TV show, this is not a drama, right? Where you tell the person, I divorce you 3 times. That is a bid'i talaq. That is an innovated kind of divorce that made the Prophet ﷺ furious. Nobody has any business in doing a triple talaq. This completely goes against the sunnah and directions of the Prophet ﷺ. People get caught up on the fact that according to most of the scholars, it counts. The fact that it counts, except according to the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah, does not make it okay, right? The sunnah way is it should be a single repudiation during a period of tuhr without any intercourse since the last period, right? That means that there was a period of purity, they have not had intercourse, and a single pronouncement of divorce. This is how divorce is supposed to be done. 1 in 100 cases, Muslims, I see somebody get divorced this way. Because when we are looking at who we want to marry, we're like, how tall and how this and how many degrees and how much money and this and that. We don't find somebody that has good qualities in deen, in good ethics and good morality. Because we're like, oh, it's from a good family. And good, as Dr. Tariq mentioned, he said, when people say good family, what do they mean? They mean wealthy family. Nowadays, when you say good family, that means rich family. But that doesn't, that worldly success does not indicate, does that make it a good family? So we have to investigate and make sure that you're getting the right person, because Allah says, live together in good terms. And the person who mistreats you in marriage is the same person who's going to mistreat you in divorce, right? And the person who's honorable in the marriage, even if things don't work out, sometimes couples don't work out. أَبْغَضُ الْحَلَالِ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ الطَّلَاقِ. Sometimes even there was the woman that came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, I want to divorce my husband. And the Prophet ﷺ said, what's wrong with him? And she said, nothing, he's a wonderful man. Everything is good about him, except I don't love him. And the Prophet ﷺ petitioned the man on her behalf. According to some, the minority view, it's binding that the divorce requested from the wife. Others, they said no, the Prophet ﷺ was recommending to the man that he should accept that divorce. So there's 2 different views about that, right? So the Hasan is 3 repudiations in 3 periods of purity. Okay, the last topic for us to talk about is that of Hajj and Umrah. You perform ghusl when you're assuming the ihram. And we get this question all the time. Even if you have your period, it does not affect the validity of the ghusl. You did the ghusl even though you're in the middle of your period. Because certain things need to have tahara. So for example, to pray you need to have tahara. having tahara is not a prerequisite for bathing. Everybody with me? So because of that, your sunnah bath and putting the ihram, it counts and it's done. You don't need to repeat that ghusl. If you do the ghusl, it's a ghusl because of your period ending. It's not the ihram ghusl. That one was done. Okay, if you experience the period, then you can fulfill all of the rituals, the manasik of Hajj, except for tawaf of the Kaaba. Okay? Now, because of the tawaf of the Kaaba, some of them, they said you should also delay the sa'i, but that's not necessary. You can perform the sa'i, especially if you do it outside of the haram, or if you do it, I think even there are opinions that you can do it within the haram because you're there for the purpose of the sa'i. And also you delay the 2 rak'ahs of nafal. Remember how you do behind Maqam Ibrahim after you do the tawaf? So that will, these 2 things are delayed. But the tawaf is very important because the tawaf is from the fard actions, from the mandatory actions of the Hajj and the Umrah. Because that tawaf is the tawaf al-qudum, tawaf al-ziyarah, the tawaf al-Umrah, right? So if you don't have that, so something is missing. And most of us coming from the West, there are 3 types of Hajj. And the Hajj that we do is Hajj Tamattu', exactly. That means that we complete the Umrah fully, then we relax and exit out of the Ihram, then we enter the Ihram at the time of the beginning of the Hajj days. Okay, we enter into a second time. There's an intervening period in which we're out of the Ihram. But there may be cases in which you're leaving Makkah and you have to be in a certain place. Now my suggestion is you can fulfill both. You can go to Mina in order to this is why you have to consult with the scholar. You can satisfy the time period that you need to spend a part of the night in Mina, and then all you have to do is take a quick taxi ride to Mecca. You can do your Umrah, or you could have started the Umrah and do just the Tawaf that's missing, and you can come back. Even if you get to the day of Arafah, there are usually solutions to this. The only problem that does not have any solution is if you have a flight coming home. If you have a flight coming home and you're still on your period and you did not complete the tawaf, then there are solutions for you, but it's an incomplete Hajj, which inshallah will be accepted, but you have to pay a penalty. In the past, it never used to happen because people would just stay another day or 2, right? But nowadays, some people have work obligations, they have flight details, and so because of that, they have to return. And so in that case, I don't want to give you the full ruling. You must sit down with the mufti and explain your particular situation, and they will give a solution. But it's usually rare because you can start the Hajj, and because Mina is down the street from Mecca, you can just go there and you can do your tawaf at any time during that period, unless if a person has a period that's, like 10, 12 days, then you're really going to have a problem. And you're going to do all of the steps, including cutting the hair. And you're going to cut the hair when you have concluded all of the steps. So let's say you're going through Hajj, but your tawaf is still missing. The same thing that happened to the wife of the Prophet ﷺ. That's why we have Masjid Aisha. Masjid Aisha is there because she had her period and she had to put on her ihram in Masjid Aisha, right? So that's fine, but only when you've completed all those requirements, then you can cut your hair, and that will conclude, which is one of the requirements, cutting of the hair, and then you can do so. Now, if you need to leave with that missing, so then you're going to wait until the very last minute before leaving, because you don't know. Maybe you'll have tuhur, and maybe you'll be able to perform the tawaf, but I hope this situation never happens to any of you, because it can be extremely stressful. So try to avoid this situation as much as possible. And then inshallah, if you think about it and you track the days, then usually you'll be able to kind of have a plan A and a plan B before you go there altogether, inshallah. I put a picture of Dr. Tariq because, these are questions also. You can ask anonymous questions if you prefer for the Ask Dr. Tariq series. He's a specialist in Sharia, right? That, as I mentioned before, this is not my area of expertise. This is really his area, a knowledge base, so we can refer to him if we have any difficult questions. Next week, we're going to do a review of Salah. We're going to go into the details of the positions and what to say and how to perform the Salah that is closest to the Sunnah. I will be presenting multiple things. So for example, where to put the hands. I will give you a couple of choices, or raising of the hands. I'm Hanafi, we don't raise the hands, but I will present the Shafi'i and the other views. I think we'll try to do all four if possible. So please join us next week at 7 p.m. inshallah. So at this point we'll take questions. We can take questions in person as well as online. Sure.
So far as the period of menstruation is concerned, medical science is long. They have given a solution to it now.
Okay.
They say that first the person, the
Recording
female
in
should count
progress.
3 cycles continuously. Count how many days this, how many days, 3 cycles. And take an average of those 3 cycles.
The average of the 3 cycles,
Then,
okay?
from the first day, 5 days before that and 5 days before that, 10 days in total.